Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville government, politics, education, the economy, really whatever gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com. Joined, as always, by co-publisher and co-founder of Compass, Scott Barker. How are you doing today, Scott?
Doing just fine. Enjoyed the 4th. Did not have to go downtown for fireworks because almost everyone in our neighborhood did a small version of the 4th of July celebration.
A lot of celebrating in North Knoxville.
Yeah. How about you?
Similar. We did not go down to the big show. I didn't even step outside our front door to see what I could see around us, but I could certainly hear a lot of it. And everybody seemed to be having a good time. And of course,
except for the dogs.
Except for the dogs, the cats. Obviously, there's always concerns about that, which I understand. But as local historian Jack Neely will tell you, in Knoxville in particular, you're just not going to stop people from setting off fireworks. We have been setting off fireworks in Knoxville at every available occasion for, a couple of centuries now. It's something we do. So,
and sometimes it's like on a random Tuesday. So
yes, right. Well, that's the thing now is over, the next several days we get everybody who didn't quite get through their stashes on the 4th. Just kind of you get your sequels. There were not a lot of fireworks on the civic front this week. You get that? See a little transition there?
Yeah, very good.
Yeah. Because it was the 4th of July week, and it's just not a week where anybody schedules much. So we took the opportunity at Compass to catch up on some of our local races in the August 1st election and talk about those. We will also be talking about a new school board policy on library materials that will be coming to the board for a vote. But first, let's talk about these elections. So as we said, this is the August 1st election we're talking about, which is the Knox County general election and is also the primary for state and federal offices. And there are quite a few contested races on the ballot. We've kind of been talking about them on a rolling basis leading up to early voting starting just this coming week now. So the first one, Scott, that we took a look at this week was County Commission District 9. And we have talked about this race a bit before. It is an interesting race. District 9 is South Knox County. It's basically everything south of the river. And that includes city neighborhoods in South Knoxville and then the more rural and suburban areas outside the city. It has traditionally been Republican. It's currently represented by incumbent Commissioner Carson Daly, who is a Republican. But the district has arguably been shifting a bit in recent years, especially those city precincts closer into the river have been trending bluer and bluer. And in the last district county race there 2 years ago, school board race, the incumbent Republican school board member, Christie, won, but not overwhelmingly. She won by fewer than 300 votes across the district. It was about a 52 to 48% margin. which, I mean, that's a 4% margin, but it's really just a 2% swing. If 2% of the voters swing, then you can change that outcome. And the Democrat that's running there is a youngish guy named Matthew Park, who is an information technology consultant, has run for office before. He ran in the Democratic primary in 2020 for House District 15. He lost to Sam McKenzie in that race. He has been involved and engaged in the local Democratic Party. But he's also the head of his neighborhood association, the Island Home Park Neighborhood Association, which, of course, is one of the big historic neighborhoods of South Knoxville, fairly prominent neighborhood politically. We've certainly had other local representatives to various offices coming out of Island Home, so that's not a bad base to run from if you're a candidate in the 9th District. He also happens to be gay, and he would be the first openly gay elected Knox County official if he wins. He's running against Republican Andy Fox, who is an interesting candidate. He is an attorney who I think people who follow local government at all, if they're familiar with Fox, it would be from his assorted activism, I guess legal activism. He has sued multiple local governments over various issues, sued the city of Knoxville over its efforts to keep guns out of the Tennessee Valley Fair. Fox represented clients who thought that people should be able to carry guns with them into the Tennessee Valley Fair. He sued both the state and the county over various manifestations of public health orders during the pandemic. He was very against any public health mandates during the pandemic. And he is basically, he's a very ideological conservative, and he will tell you that straight up, and that his biggest concern in this race, as he put it, is making sure that Knox County doesn't turn more liberal. And so he wants to be a very conservative voice for the 9th District. He is opposed to greater growth and development or denser growth and development. And part of the reason that he is given for that, I mean, he is reflecting a lot of concerns of people who live in the district. This is a district, especially in the more rural areas, where people have raised a lot of concerns about new development and creating traffic on, some of the rural roads and so forth. But even in that issue, Fox has an ideological framing, because he says that, the data shows, which he's correct, that overall, the more densely populated an area is, the more likely it is to vote more liberal. And so I think he sees it as, if we can stop places from getting too dense, then we'll stop people from turning too liberal. And so he won a contested Republican primary against Barry Neal, who is another neighborhood association president, or not president, but active in his neighborhood association. And Neal was endorsed by Carson Daly, the incumbent, but Fox defeated him pretty strongly. I think it was close to a 70%, 70-30 margin in that race. So that would already be an interesting kind of contrast between these two candidates, especially because among the organizations that Fox has done legal work for is the national conservative legal group Alliance Defending Freedom, which is the largest, most active legal organization involved in fighting against LGBTQ rights across the country. And Fox has done work for them. So, obviously interesting to have somebody who's worked for a group that has basically been called a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and a candidate who happens to be gay. And so that is interesting. But then the other element that comes in here is there is a third candidate, an independent candidate, Stacey Bryan Smith, who is running on a platform that is partly biblical in nature, or is, let's say, informed by his own sort of sense of the Bible and how he thinks people should live according to its commandments. And that includes, he's an environmentalist, because he believes that per the Bible, there is a mandate for people to be good stewards of the planet and care for the landscape and all of its living creatures. And so he has concerns about growth and development on those grounds, among other grounds. And both he and Fox showed up at the Planning Commission last month to speak against some new proposed developments in South Knox County. Park has a somewhat more nuanced take on growth and development. He said he very much wants to protect the more rural areas. He grew up on a family farm, not in Knox County, but in Benton, Tennessee. And so, he values the rural areas. And actually, he thinks the county needs a new position called an agricultural coordinator. He wants there to be somebody whose job it is to work with local farmers and to, provide whatever resources can be provided for them, but also can maybe serve as a liaison between people who might be getting ready to sell their farms or don't want to work them anymore, and younger people who might be interested in taking up farming. And, that he thinks the county could play a role in helping to encourage new farmers to go into farming, which is, in his view, the best way to preserve farms is to make sure there are farmers. But at the same time, he supports more growth and density in the more urban areas closer into the river, where, of course, we're seeing tremendous new growth and density there on the south waterfront. And he thinks that is good because it's a way to have growth and allow for, new people to come in, but it keeps it contained in areas where there's a lot of infrastructure. You're close to downtown. You're not having that impact on, it's not urban sprawl. It's actual urban development in the existing urban areas. And he was endorsed, probably partly because of that, by the East Tennessee Realtors, who, of course, in general are in favor of building more and more different kinds of residential development. So, Scott, I don't know how to read the tea leaves on this race. There are a whole lot of different things coming into play. Of course, we have talked about in previous weeks that one thing that happened was some of Fox's supporters tried to keep Stacey Bryan Smith off the ballot, presumably because they're afraid that he might peel away some Republican, traditional Republican voters who maybe don't like Fox or maybe just know Smith and his family. But I think it creates it's interesting, I guess, is all I can say about it.
Yeah, and this is a race that can cut many different ways, depending on how people vote. Are people are there Republican voters who are turned off by Fox, and will he lose votes, and to whom would he lose them? And Park is interesting. He's you mentioned this about Island Home and its status. I mean, Tommy Smith, the vice mayor of the city, lives in Island Home, and Joe Hultquist was a city council member who lives in Island Home.
Hultquist, by the way, is supporting Fox. Interestingly, Tommy Smith is supporting Matthew Park, and Hultquist is supporting Fox.
And but I mean, it's a place where a lot of local leaders have come from, and it's and Park is interesting. He's not only he fits the mold of a city candidate, very, very nicely, and I think that he'll do very well in those areas. It's those rural areas where this race will probably be decided.
Yep, and the fact that Park is, he's not running as the gay candidate, but he is a candidate who is gay, and he doesn't in any way downplay that. On his campaign literature, he has a photo of him with his husband, like candidates do on their literature. They've photographed themselves with their spouses. He said it was interesting when he's knocking on doors and he hands people his mailer, and they kind of see that picture, that he's gotten, kind of interesting reactions from people, including like, I'm not sure I've ever met a gay person before. And he says, well, here I am. Yep. On your doorstep.
Pleasure to meet you.
And he said that he does think that even though it's like not the focus of his campaign. He thinks it's significant because if he were elected, he thinks having representation from a minority group that, frankly, is often still discriminated against in various ways by various levels of government would be helpful, both for that community, the LGBTQ community, but also, as he put it, for the other people on commission who, I'm sure some people on county commission have gay friends and relatives and so forth, because lots of people do, but maybe some of them don't so much, and that he could be, somebody who they could get to know, and as he said, kind of see that, we're not so scary. It would just provide a voice on commission that just obviously hasn't been there before, particularly when it comes to certain kinds of issues that get raised. I think that either way, if you assume that the most likely winner, of course, it's always possible that Stacey Bryan Smith wins, but if you assume that the most likely winner is from one of the two major parties, I think either we're going to have a very interesting commissioner in Park, or we're going to have a very interesting commissioner in Fox, because Fox is really a kind of ideological combatant to a degree that we mostly don't see on our local bodies. And, there have been a couple of county commissioners in recent years who have latched on to kind of bigger national issues and brought resolutions, trying to put commission on record on these sort of culture war issues. Overall, county commission has not been very receptive to those. A lot of commissioners just not really feeling like that's their place to have those fights at the local level. But I think if Fox is elected, we can anticipate seeing more of those kinds of resolutions and discussions. So it will be interesting either way.
Oh yeah, that's one of the most interesting races to follow.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, maybe a race that gets people somewhat less excited, except for when their tax bills show up. We also wrote about the property assessor's race, and of course this pits former property assessor Phil Ballard, a Republican, against Drew Harper, who is a Democrat and has not held office before. Scott, you wrote about this. What stands out to you about this race?
Well, one of the things, and this is standard for every election, property assessor really isn't a policy making office. It's a very, very much a functional office. They have to follow state law. It's very there are a lot of people who wonder why we even elect the property assessor, because it's it's very much a follow the rules kind of position. But the big thing is in this one, it's Ballard with his 8 years of experience. Of course, it was 8 years ago, but he was a two-term assessor. Between him and the current assessor John Whitehead, they've held that office for 24 years. I think it's been the only assessor that a lot of people know has either been Ballard or Whitehead.
And if Ballard wins and could serve 2 terms, that could mean that we would go from basically 2000 to 2032 with just those 2 guys as property assessor.
But like I said, it's not a policy-making position, so he's got that experience. And Harper doesn't have. Obviously, he's not been the assessor before. He's not worked in the assessor's office, but he does. He is a small-scale. Hesitate to say developer, but he's an investor for sure. And he's works with a nonprofit, or has helped form a nonprofit called Yes Knoxville, which is about more housing choices, walkable neighborhoods, that sort of thing.
It's kind of a local manifestation of the YIMBY movement that people might have read about.
Yes, and in fact, he lives in. He just recently renovated a building on Washington Pike where into 4 apartments, and said that he needed to put his money where his mouth was, and so he's living in one of the apartments. But he owns the building, and he owns other buildings.
But he's not afraid of multifamily housing.
He's
basically.
not afraid of multifamily housing. Anyway, but has nothing to do with being the property assessor. But he, when you ask him about experience, he points out, hey, I have as much experience as Phil Ballard had when he was first elected. And he's right. He does. Ballard was an insurance guy, or I think still is. But anyway, that's the main difference. Harper did not have an opponent in the primary, so he kind of skated through there, and Ballard did, in fact, the closest race I can remember, he defeated Jackie Raley, who was the deputy property assessor under Whitehead, and he defeated her by 12 votes out of almost 43,000 cast.
An astonishingly slim margin. Very
slim. And he spent all of his money on the primary. He loaned himself a little bit more than $100,000, but he spent almost all of it on it. So as of March 31st, which was the last reporting period that we've had, the next one will be out. Campaign disclosures will be out in a few days for the second quarter. But for the first quarter, basically they had the same amount of money left. And neither one of them had a lot. It was $5,000 or $6,000. Not much at all. But one of the things Ballard has said is that a lot of the technology that he introduced as the assessor before has been shelved, and he wants to upgrade the technology of the office, and he was very critical of the last assessment, which was 2022, and it was very a lot of people were upset over that because it reflected a lot of the soaring property values, and a lot of people are paying more in taxes because of that, and it was there were a lot of appeals that were made at that time, and he thought that it could have been done more smoothly. Harper is not quite as critical of that assessment, although he was slightly. His big thing is educating the public on what the assessor's office is, what it does, how they do their job, how they come up with the assessments that they do, because it does affect your property taxes. It's one of the key components of that, and even though the rate is set by county commission or city council, it's based on the values that the property assessor assigns to every property in Knox County. So,
yeah, and I think that is something that people get confused about, and certainly there is room for public education there because, like when we talk on the podcast sometimes about how there hasn't been a county property tax increase in 25 years, which is true, inevitably we will hear from some readers or listeners who will say, I don't know what you're talking about. My taxes keep going up. I'm like, well, right, because there are two ways that your taxes can go up. One is that the local government raises its tax rate, and so then you pay more for whatever your property is assessed at. The other is that your property value goes up, and so the rate is the same, but you're now applying that rate to a higher valuation. That has happened.
Yes.
And as you said, especially in that 2022 reassessment, a lot of the overall countywide property values went up tremendously, and so that meant that a lot of people are paying more in property taxes now than they were a few years ago, but that does not reflect a property tax increase. It reflects a higher valuation. And the valuation part is what the assessor's office does. And I think one thing that could be coming, there's discussion at the state level of changing the law. The law currently requires an assessment every 4 years, although our most recent one, actually, they took 5 years because of the pandemic kind of set things sideways a bit. But there's talk at the state level of doing that more frequently, every 2 years or even every year, because so many areas of Tennessee are seeing escalating property values, and there's a concern that only doing it every 4 years is not really capturing what's going on in the marketplace.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The 5 year interval before the last was, one of the reasons they did that was because in the 4 year cycle, a property in Knox County, the property assessor would come into office and immediately have to do an assessment. And so, if you're a new property assessor, then you basically are being thrown into the deep end of the pool immediately. This gives the assessor a year, because our next assessment's going to be 2026, and so a year to be in office. But so that also added to the soaring valuations, because it was based over your increase in value over 5 years, not over 4 years. So yeah, and that would change things quite a bit. If they do that, the property assessor's office probably would need more staffing, and that's where kind of a lot of the focus is in that office is on the staff. Ballard has basically alleged that there's been a lot of turnover under Whitehead's most recent 2 terms, and he will stop that. And Harper, on the other hand, was saying, I'm not going to come in and change everything, and I think the staff does a good job, and so I'm not. He said, a lot of times people are worried that you're a political, the new political leader comes in and clears house and puts his cronies in. He said he's not going to do that. So.
Well, of course, this is a countywide race, and as we have said before about countywide races in general, Democrats have a hard time. No Democrat has won a countywide race here in 18 years, so it could still happen. And Harper, he's realistic. He understands that, but he said that he's hoping that people are just tired of the same people doing the same jobs over and over again, and the switching back and forth between Whitehead and Ballard and Whitehead again. He thinks that a lot of people are tired of that and would want a fresh. It's not really a fresh perspective, because you really, as we said, there's not a whole lot of. There's no policy to bring perspective to, but there's fresh eyes, new energy, that sort of thing. Different name. Right. All right. Well, we also this week had a feature story by our summer intern, Owen McCarthy, about State Representative Gloria Johnson in her run for U.S. Senate. And Owen went out and kind of shadowed her as she talked to voters in Loudoun County, and then talked to her about how her campaign has been going. And we really did this story just because it's a relative novelty to have a local office holder seeking statewide federal office. And of course, Johnson is an interesting figure, one of the Tennessee Three, that whole situation where her Republican supermajority tried to expel her and 2 of her colleagues, did expel her 2 colleagues, did not expel her, although just barely. But that elevated her profile statewide and really made her into kind of a national political figure. And so she and the state Democratic Party are kind of trying to leverage that into campaign for Senate. And of course, she does have opponents in the Democratic primary on August 1st. She is by far the best funded and organized and visible of those candidates. Mm-hmm. And so I think she probably is the favorite to win the Democratic primary. Of course, as Owen talked about with her in her story, I think our headline was actually uphill battle. We talked about the problem Democrats have winning seats countywide. They also have a very hard time in the last couple of decades winning anything statewide.
Yeah, it's been 3 decades since Tennessee's elected a Democratic senator. But one of the things you were talking about being a novelty that someone from Knoxville runs for the Senate, and it is, and that she's going to be, that Johnson is can be considered the Democratic front runner. 2 years ago she wouldn't have been considered a front runner. The Tennessee 3 incident, or whatever you want to call it, situation, really propelled her. And she's this was when Owen went out. The campaign is going to all 95 counties in Tennessee, because of course many counties in West Tennessee, other than the Tennessee 3 thing, never heard of Gloria Johnson, and so she's going around the state to every single county to meet with people and trying to drum up support. And she was Loudoun was one of the counties she was in the other day. Loudoun County is a Republican stronghold. Yeah. So that's one of the. I
mean, really, all of East Tennessee is a Republican stronghold.
That's true, and so she was so she was there talking to people. She's still very she has been kind of buoyed by this Vanderbilt University poll that shows that on a variety of issues, abortion, gun violence, various other issues, Tennesseans, a majority of Tennesseans are on, pretty much line up with her progressive stances on all those issues, rather than the conservative Republican stances on those issues. And she's really counting on that. She's also, which of course the incumbent is Marsha Blackburn, very conservative Republican, very much aligned with former President Donald Trump. But this poll actually showed that women voters in Tennessee prefer her over Blackburn.
Yeah.
Now, overall, Blackburn's ahead by about 11 percentage points, but Johnson thinks that's within reach.
Well, I mean, if you got a huge turnout among women and somehow a much lower turnout among men, maybe that could make a difference. But no, I do think it's very interesting that she is leading among women, because I think those issues that she's really focusing on, which are abortion, access to reproductive health care, gun safety, and health care, those are all issues that I think resonate particularly with women voters. And so it does, we're seeing that kind of gender sorting going on at the national level too. It's interesting that divide carries down even into what is basically a fairly red state like Tennessee. So yes, we don't know what's going to happen in that race. The most likely thing obviously is that Johnson wins the Democratic primary and then has a very steep climb,
yes,
as we said in the story, in November. But certainly we will continue writing about it and kind of tracking her efforts. I do think what you said was interesting about, the way her profile was elevated by the Tennessee 3 situation. That was kind of a classic example of something that people call the Streisand effect, which comes from Barbara Streisand. And there was a time where Streisand and her lawyers tried to stop a magazine from publishing photos of her clifftop house in Malibu. And in the course of that effort, they actually brought more attention to it and led to greater distribution of the photo than would have happened without them trying to stop it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, the Republican supermajority in the legislature was really trying to silence these voices, essentially. That their whole effort stemmed from the three of them, Johnson and Representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, staging a 5-minute demonstration on the floor of the House. So, in trying to silence them and actually kicking out Pearson and Jones, the Republicans created 3 new celebrities
Yes.
with literal national profiles and national fundraising reach. I mean, Johnson is way behind Blackburn in fundraising, but she's for a Tennessee Democratic Senate candidate, she's blowing the lid off. She's raised over $3 million, and that is almost entirely attributable to what the Republicans in the legislature did.
Yeah, it was one of those things where if they had gavelled them down and just berated them and then moved on, it would have been a one-day story, and nobody outside of Tennessee would care.
Yeah.
But by trying to expel them, especially since the other 2 of the Tennessee 3 are African Americans, by doing that, it brought in all kinds of national attention, and yes, Johnson benefited from that, and and all of the Tennessee 3 are in the legislature still. I mean, it didn't really affect the balance, and Johnson, and this is one thing that needs to be mentioned, is that even if Johnson doesn't win against Blackburn, and it is an uphill battle for her, but she will still keep her legislative seat because she's also running for re-election in her District 90 seat, which is in Knoxville, and she's unopposed in both the
right. The
Democratic
Republican Party didn't even manage or choose to recruit a candidate to run against her for the legislative seat.
Yeah.
Essentially, just giving her a free pass there.
Yeah, and so even in the event that she does not have success against Blackburn, she will still be in the legislature and doing her thing there.
Doing her thing, which is, among other things, really irritating the Republican supermajority.
The supermajority does not like Gloria Johnson at all.
Yeah.
She's very good at poking that bear.
Yep, for sure. All right. Well, the other thing I wanted to talk about, apart from elections this week, is a new policy that the school board is looking at. It will be on their agenda when they have their meetings next week. And this is having to do with library materials and what materials are appropriate for students in school libraries. There's been discussion about this over the last 6 months or so. Really driven by, we have a local chapter of Moms for Liberty, the conservative activist group that has only been around for a couple of years, formed in Florida and has kind of spread nationwide with a lot of conservative funders kind of pushing it. And initially, when the local Moms for Liberty group started, they singled out some books that they found. The Knox County Schools has all of their school library catalogs online because the state passed a law a few years ago saying that they had to, that all public schools in the state had to. So those are online. You can go and search their catalog. And so what the Moms for Liberty group did was they just took a national list of books that other conservatives have objected to other places, and they just kind of went down the list and looked in the catalog and said, aha, this one is at Carnes High School, this one is at Bearden High School, and so forth. And so on their website, you can see they have a list of about 50 titles that they've identified using those lists that they say have objectionable, sexually explicit content of various kinds. And if you look at the books that they're singling out, and this is true across the country, they are heavily concentrated on books by and about LGBTQ people, by and about racial minorities. Nobel laureate Toni Morrison's book, The Bluest Eye, which at this point is 50 years old and has been, controversial for all 50 of its years, really because it has a couple of, it's not a book about sex. It has a couple of scenes with sexual content in it, which mostly have to do with sexual abuse. Like, this is not a work of erotica, it's a work of literature that has some difficult scenes in it. And that's the case with several of these books. And a lot of the books on the list are popular with students because they are about, they're books for young adults for the most part, and a lot of them are about young adult characters who are dealing with difficult issues. Some of them are books dealing with drug addiction, some deal with sexual abuse, but things that actually happen to real people, including real people in Knox County, including real actual teenagers in Knox County have these things happen in their lives. These are books that reflect some of those experiences and is maybe why they're popular among students. So what has happened now is the state has, and Knox County has kind of taken some half measures to introduce some other levels of review, but the Moms for Liberty group and some of the more conservative school board members basically weren't really satisfied with those efforts. Because those efforts left the decisions ultimately mostly in the hands of school librarians. And these are people who don't trust school librarians, who in fact routinely accuse school librarians of being groomers or sexual predators. There's this whole kind of conservative cultural mythology out there that our schools are full of people trying to quote unquote sexualize children. This is just basically not true at all. Of course, you can find individual incidents across the country of, teachers. Sure, there are teachers who have molested children, but, there's also preachers who have molested children and Boy Scout leaders who have molested children. There is not an endemic, pandemic, epidemic of child molestation going on in our schools. And really what these pushes are about, obviously, is it's people with particular religious conservative agendas who just don't like this material. They don't like that there are books about and by gay people in their kids' schools, and so they're raising objections to them. And that's kind of the cultural and religious background to it. But the state legislature this year passed a new law, or an amendment to a law they passed a couple of years ago called the Age Appropriate Materials Act, governing what can be in school libraries. And the new section that they added to that law took a lot of local decision making away and said it gave a list of certain kinds of content that if they are in a work, a book or graphic novel or whatever it is, whatever the material is, if it includes these things, it says it's inappropriate for Tennessee students at any grade level K through 12. So here we're treating all Tennessee children, all Tennessee minors ages 5 to 17 like they are exactly the same, and they are not, what's not acceptable for a 5-year-old is also not acceptable for a 17-year-old, even though approximately half the 17-year-olds in Tennessee are actually sexually active. Nevertheless, they're not allowed to hear or read about it. And so what this says is that anything with content that depicts sexual activity, sexual excitement, or nudity, and it defines nudity very specifically, and nudity is just nudity. It doesn't even have to be sexual, just like if it shows, and it gets very specific, if it has a nipple that is not fully covered by an opaque covering below the top part of the nipple, so kind of like you can maybe get a little bit of the areola in there, but you can't show any of the nipple. Is like you can
titillate a little bit, but you can't be explicit. Okay.
So the board, has rewritten their policy, and members of the school board have sort of a range of opinions about this, from more liberal members who think it should be left to librarians to more conservative members who are pretty much just in favor of taking some of the stuff off of the shelves, but they have to abide by state law. And so they are rewriting this policy to say that none of these books can be on the shelves. And, if you think about, well, what is this actually going to affect? that's going to be the hard question for school staff to figure out, because, I mean, I guess you could start with the list that Moms for Liberty has produced, because they have identified those, and go through them and see. Sorry, we have a Seth Barber's cat is chiming in here. You have some opinions about library materials. So there are those, sorry, we just had a black cat run through the studio here. I'm not sure if this is a bad sign. At least it's not October yet. So where were we? Oh, right. Banning books. So you can start with that list that Moms for Liberty has produced. But, if you think about it more, and that list, as I said, is kind of heavily focused on the things that they are particularly concerned about, which is LGBTQ content, and also maybe things having to do with racial minorities and so forth. But if you just kind of look at the way the law is written, it's not hard to start thinking of books that could easily be affected by it. And so a couple that I thought of that I then went and looked at the online catalog to see if they were there were, for example, the Game of Thrones series by George R.R. Martin. Massively popular series, widely read, including by many teenage readers across the country over the last 20 years. It was a huge, successful HBO series, also massively popular. Cultural phenomenon. You would be hard-pressed to say that this is any way out of step with mainstream American culture. It is mainstream American culture, these books. But, what do these books have in them? Like, the opening chapters include a fairly explicit sex scene between an adult man and woman who happen to be brother and sister. So there's an explicit scene of incest right out of the gate with this series. And then when they are observed by a younger character, they try to murder him by throwing him out a window. And that's just the start. I mean, you go on in this series, sex, violence, you name it. Really gruesome violence. There are scenes of people being flayed alive. There's a castration sequence. It's extremely difficult to read, and that's just that one series of books. Another one and those are in school libraries. I checked; they're in many of our school libraries. At the more literary end, you think about somebody like Cormac McCarthy, who's Knoxville writer. He was not a Nobel laureate, but he won essentially every other literary prize you could win, including the Pulitzer. And at the time of his death last year, he was widely regarded as one of the greatest living American novelists. And several of his books show up on lists of like the greatest books of the 20th century or the greatest American novels ever written and so forth. But his books are full of difficult, problematic material. Blood Meridian, which I think is one of the most amazing books I've ever read and is kind of maybe widely considered his masterpiece. Again, it's on lists of like the greatest books of the 20th century, is also on lists of the most absolutely gruesome, violent works ever written. And I've read this book. It is full of it's sort of like horror and atrocity after horror and atrocity. All of that is there for a reason. It's there for a purpose. The book has a point. It has a sort of moral argument that it's making. But you cannot argue that book does not include excess violence, which is one of the things that's supposed to be banned under this law. And that book is in school libraries, and several of McCarthy's other books are also in school libraries, and his other books have things like necrophilia. There's more incest. There's,
there's sex with watermelon.
There's sex with watermelons. So is this what's going to happen? And that a certain amount of that is still going to be up to school librarians, because they're the ones who have to curate their collections. And so assuming the board approves this policy in the coming week, and I'm sure there will be some discussion about this at their meetings this week, but probably they're going to approve the policy because, again, it is just putting them in line with state law. They can't just vote like, no, we're going to ignore this state law. Is this what's going to happen? And I have put in a request for, I want to know any books that get banned as a result of this change in policy, because I think it will be instructive to see, how they approach it, which particular materials, are they just going to use the list given them by Moms for Liberty? Are they going, going to wait for complaints to come in? Like, how is this actually going to be handled? We'll have to see. But it does look like one way or another, basically, like the book banners under this law have scored a significant victory in Tennessee in terms of being able to just take things off the shelves.
Can I interrupt? I'm sorry, with a functional question here. As a librarian, how do they bring new books in? Like, just from scratch. Like, if a book series comes out and it's real popular with the kids and a librarian wants to bring it in their library, is a librarian locally free to do that? Or is there a process that it goes through either the school board or the state before it's even brought into the library in the first place? Because this is one of the things I always get confused on.
Yeah, there is a process, and this is something that district officials have talked about in recent months as these questions have been raised. And they basically said, we have a process. Like, there's kind of this idea that things are somehow sneaking their way onto school shelves, and like that is absolutely not what happens. Yes, they have a process that's spelled out in school board policy. And they have school librarians who are the library specialists who the school board the school system hires for their expertise. They are trained librarians, and there's a whole matrix of criteria that go into making determinations about age appropriateness of materials. And so all of that already exists. Like, we already have a fairly detailed system that is run by specialists in the area.
Okay, but just to make sure I understand correctly, a librarian could bring a series in on their own,
yes,
as long as they can say it checks this box, it doesn't check this box, right, of excludable material or whatever. Like,
right.
But a librarian locally themselves could do it as long as, when a question arises,
yeah,
they
not
can say,
just
I went through the
could
process.
do it, but that's literally what they're hired to do.
Yeah, like, that's their job.
They are the people who do that. Like, if you're going to end up with books in a school library, they have to get there somehow. And the people who we hire to do that are school librarians. Like, that's how it works. It's the same. Like, and they do have a challenge process, which the county has had for years. If anybody, but it has to be a parent, a student, or a teacher, school employee, has concern about some book or material that's available that they think is inappropriate, there is a process they can use to challenge that. And guess what? It very rarely happens. Like, part of this interesting thing with this whole conversation is there's no evidence that this is a widespread problem or concern, or that it was a widespread problem or concern before we got this national political push. This is all part of a national political push. Almost none of it has arisen from any kind of grassroots complaints. Knox County had one challenge to one book in one of its libraries 2 years ago. This past year they had 7, and a lot of that was because this is as the conversation, with Moms for Liberty and so forth started up. But even at that, that's 7 challenges in a district with almost 60,000 students and families, and I don't know how many thousands of books in school libraries. So, I go to every school board meeting. The number of people who are not members of Moms for Liberty, which again is a national conservative organization, who have ever come to a school board meeting in the last many years to raise objections about materials, I could certainly count on one hand, and it might be 0, because I can't off the top of my head think of anybody who hasn't been part of this particular push. So to me, it all feels very kind of ginned up elsewhere and brought in. And so it became a national political issue, and now it's a state political issue. So you get the state, passing these very strict criteria that are then pushed down to the local level. And so now this is going to happen. We are going to get books banned. But I just think everybody should be clear that that's why we're getting books banned. We're not getting books banned because there's been any upsurge of like actual Knox County students or parents. In fact, and we'll see what happens at this week's meetings, but the times that this has come up for discussion at school board, the Moms for Liberty group and their allies have been vastly outnumbered by actual students and actual teachers showing up and saying, don't do this. There's reasons that these, librarians have said that we have books in our libraries that are there to serve the wide and diverse range of students who are our customers, are our population. And librarians say that they are responsive to the students and their interests and what their concerns are, and that they are providing materials to try to answer their questions. It is true that they are not selecting their materials on the basis of, does some particular religious group somewhere object to this, because that's not who they're serving. They're serving the students of Knox County who are, they come from all sorts of different backgrounds and families with all sorts of different views and beliefs. But it is what it is, as they say. And so, I will say that, like, if anybody can't tell, I'm a reporter, I'm a journalist, I'm a pretty strong First Amendment person. I have fairly strong principled concerns about efforts to ban material and information based on the long and almost entirely bad history of such things in our own country and other places. And so, if I sound like I'm ringing an alarm of any kind here, I am, because the alarm is, this is going to affect things that are available to students in Knox County schools, to families in Knox County, but it's not being generated by them. It's being generated by national political organizations that have been using this as a wedge political issue in recent years, and it's being pushed down from them through our state legislature down to the level of the school board. It's clearly being imposed by people with very strong political, religious agendas, but does not, as far as I can tell, anything that I have ever seen, reflect anything organic about the actual students, teachers, and families in Knox County. And, you can also get into the whole argument of, like, does any of this even matter? Everybody's got smartphones, and there are a few board members who have said, to be worried in 2024 about books on the shelves at the school library when almost every kid is walking around with a phone that can access any number of materials that have absolutely not been curated by school librarians, seems kind of absurd if you think that the real goal here is to quote unquote protect children. But if you think that the goals are other than that, if you think that the goals are political and that this is about winning elections and so forth, then, I think it all makes a lot more sense. But
what I'm looking forward to is this next legislative session. If the legislature will try to amend this to ban depictions of watermelon sex, because it's not banned in the law right now.
It's true.
So that section of Suttree is...
Well, it does say any sexual activity normal or perverted, which I love as a phrase, because, like, who in our legislature is deciding what is quote unquote normal sex? Like, are we going to get to a point where, of course, in the not too distant past, actually, we did have laws governing specific sex acts that were, like, legal or illegal for people to engage in. I will say that based on what we know about the proclivities of our legislators, which fortunately is not very much, but we do know some based on a couple of scandals involving Republican legislators that have come out in the last 5 or 10 years. Their definitions of normal sex appear to be pretty broad. So if we're going to go by the standards set by our own Republican legislators, that finding something that didn't qualify as normal sex might be difficult. Anyway, we'll see what happens. I guess.
All right. I'm sorry. This is a joke. I apologize. But and this goes off of some of the normal sex of some of our state legislatures. So, like, is animal husbandry part of the conversation as far as that goes, and how that might teach a kid how certain things work, and whether in an animal husbandry readings you meet a state legislature and fall in love and marry him later in life? Is that the kind of questions we might be concerned with in the future of normal or not? Sorry, if you get the joke, you get the joke.
I do get the joke, and I guess we'll just have to see. All right. Well, we can go ahead and talk about what's coming up in the next week, and we will start with the school board. We were just talking about they're having their monthly work session Monday at 5:00 in the Summer Place boardroom. The voting meeting Thursday, the 11th, also at 5:00, also in the Summer Place boardroom. And they are going to be talking about that library materials policy and a couple of other related policies that they're adjusting. I assume those will probably pass because, like I said, this is all based on state law. It's not something that the school board looks to have a tremendous amount of leeway with. There's also going to be an interesting presentation at Monday's meeting. A group of students is bringing a proposal and this is led by, there's a student board member every year. It's generally a high school senior gets appointed to the board. They're not a voting member, but they show up at the meetings and they sometimes weigh in representing student voices and concerns. And this past year's representative, she's been working on this with some of her friends, and they are bringing a policy. They're advocating for the school system to provide free period products in girls' bathrooms in Knox County schools. And, they're kind of saying this is basic health and hygiene. The school system provides toilet paper, they provide paper towels, and their argument is that for some students, especially lower income students, it may be a bit of a financial burden to have access to those products at home and bring them to school, or you're dealing with students who are maybe just experiencing getting their period and aren't always prepared for it. And, suddenly you're at school and they have cited some instances of students who have had to leave school in the middle of the day because they suddenly realize that they don't have a tampon. And so they're advocating that this is something that should just be normally provided in school bathrooms and girls' bathrooms. And there are several other school systems that actually do already do this. So they're going to make a presentation, and I don't know what the price tag on that would be if the school system just added that into their supplies budget, but I'm sure that would be part of the conversation. So it's an interesting issue, and it's an interesting issue to be brought by students themselves saying, hey, this is a need that we see in our schools. So they'll be talking about that on Monday. Or maybe, no, that I think will be at the Thursday meeting, actually. And then, Scott, also on Monday, we have one more candidate event ahead of the August 1st election. Yeah,
and this is the League of Women Voters is putting this on. It's not a forum in the traditional sense of what they usually do. It's they're calling it a meet and greet, and it's for the candidates for property assessor, which we talked about earlier, and law director. And they've invited all four candidates. Have all agreed to be there, at least according to the league. But the setup's going to be they're going to come there and give some statements. There will be a couple of questions that'll be asked of the candidates, but primarily it'll be a session where voters can go talk to them one-on-one individually and get to know them and understand what they're all about. It starts at 6:30 p.m. at Messiah Lutheran Church on Kingston Pike, just west of Bearden Hill.
All right. Well,
but anyway, that's that. Then Tuesday night, we got City Council, their regular meeting. Probably the biggest item on the agenda is a payment in lieu of tax proposal for an expansion of Marble Alley, which is an apartment complex in downtown Knoxville, a block east of Gay Street, very prominent coming from East Knoxville, very prominent on the skyline. And the developer, Buzz Goss, is asking for a 9-year pilot, which basically freezes property tax for 9 years, and so they can get the funding for the project. One of the interesting things is first of all, the expansion is going to be 167 units. 15 of them are going to be workforce housing, which is basically only for people who households make 80% or less than the median income for the county. So, and the city is increasingly, that is one of the things they strongly encourage developers to do if they're seeking any kind of tax deal. One of the interesting things is, and this kind of gets in the weeds a little bit, but there's a third-party assessment that's done on all of these proposals, and one of the things they look at is what is the internal rate of return. Basically, it's not return on investment, but it's a type of return on investment. It's after a certain number of years, what's your annual increase in value of the property. Banks tend to not lend money unless it's between 12 and 20%. And most of the pilot requests come in, they'll be like 10%. And so the pilot is needed to get above that 12% threshold. At this one, even without the pilot, it's slightly, barely inside that, above that 12% threshold. But that's also without the workforce housing component. So with the pilot, the internal rate of return will be 14%, and there would be the workforce housing thing. So that's kind of the balancing act that the council members will be looking at on Tuesday on that.
And that's also a project that has sort of been long gestating because that's county-owned property. And Goss, who developed the northern part of it for the current Marble Alley complex some years ago, has had an option on that property to build out this second phase for years. And the county actually kind of nudged him last year and basically told him that if he didn't get underway, that they were going to look elsewhere for other interested developers, which he did then. Yeah,
and and one of the things that's been interesting about watching this go through, it's already been through Planning Commission, so we covered that too. Is that in most of downtown, and in this property included, you need to have commercial space on the ground floor. And now this was when the original Marble Alley was, the first phase was built. You didn't have to, but there isn't any. That's a requirement, but there's almost no commercial activity on State Street, which is the street this is on. There's parking garages, there's a cemetery, there's a church, there's the back of the Tennessee Theater, but there's no real businesses back there, so there's not a lot of foot traffic looking for a place to go to. There will be Goss tried to get around this by making the ground floor units live workspaces where you could live and work out of them and all. And then they persuaded him at the planning to make the corner of State and Union to make it there'll be a retail space there or commercial space there, and then but yeah, it's it's one of the few it's a surface parking lot now. It's one of the few kind of open spaces to build downtown.
Yep.
And then and speaking of the Planning Commission, they're meeting on Thursday at 1:30. And they're going to see. They always have a variety of things. Sometimes things get postponed. Sometimes things bubble up that you don't realize are going to be controversial and are. But a couple of things that are notable that they're going to be doing. Belltown, the basically small town that is being built on in North Knox County on either side of Emory Road, west of Clinton Highway. Their plans for the commercial section of it, which is south of Emory Road, is coming up for approval by Planning Commission. They've been kind of piecemealing these details of their plan with Planning Commission. We haven't been writing about all of them because a lot of them are just, two streets in the residential development part, but this is the whole commercial area. There's going to be retail space, retail restaurant area, townhouses. There's going to be a park along Beaver Creek at the south end of the property. So there's a lot of parts in there. And another development that has been, this one's been real controversial, is the Thunder Mountain development in South Knox County. They've got a portion of their property that's on Chapman Highway. There's a proposal. They've got a proposal to rezone it to more commercial use. It's not commercial right now. A lot of it's open space. So and then there's another large residential section that they're wanting to get rezoned to for a little bit greater density. So it'll be back up again, and it always generates some opposition from the area residents who live there now.
And will not be surprising if some of the candidates in that District 9 race that we were talking about show up to talk about that.
No, it would not surprise me. They did before.
Yep.
They had before. Oh, and one other thing that's on the agenda, it's one of the things we talked about a little bit, and it's kind of an interesting thing, is a couple who live in South Knox County and have a off-road trail system on their property for ATVs and dirt bikes and those kinds of things, motorized dirt bikes, motorcycles, and it's not allowed in the zoning anywhere. So they're trying to get it zoned, get the use approved, and they're having that use is not approved in any zone for Knox County. So they're trying to figure out how to get that going, and there's not real controversial about it. There's neighbors. He's got one neighbor, doesn't care, doesn't bother him. They're only open like on weekends. So it's just kind of one of those interesting things that come up in Planning Commission where there's nothing that directly addresses it in the code,
right?
And they've got to make it up as they go along.
All right. Well, the other thing happening this coming week is early voting starts on Friday, July 12th.
It does.
And we will have continued election coverage through the coming week. There's still some local races for us to profile there. So we will be back next week to talk about those and all of the other things going on in these meetings, and also anything else that happens in the interim. Thanks, as always, to Lord Seth Barber for his production work here with Barbarian Productions. Our theme music is by Will Wright, and we will talk to you later.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily, in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions. and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.